I'll go full screen right now. So, thank you everyone for being here and listening to me talk. I will be talking about the Quran of Uthman, the beginning of the Quranic manuscript tradition in the 7th century. And this is a research I've been doing a lot, and it's a lot of fun to kind of, talk about these things and talk about this really fascinating history of the Quranic text and how it developed in this very early period. And what we can know about it, working with textual sources that we have, working with the material evidence that we have, and figure it out that way. So, traditionally, it is thought that around 632, the Prophet Muhammad died, but there was no official standard text of the Quran in his time. And then it is generally said that around 632 to 4, the first Caliph Abu Bakr has the Quran written down in some written form, and that written form ends up in the possession of Hafsa, the widow of Muhammad, who comes to own it. But even at that time, there wasn't a single standard text in that sense. There wasn't a text that everybody used and was able to open up a book, and that was the Quran. Traditionally, it is said that only happens around the 650s when the third Caliph Uthman comes into power, and he has an actual official standardization mission where he says we're going to make a standard text. And not only are we going to write down a standard text, which will from then on be the Quran, we'll also distribute it to the Islamic Empire, the nascent Islamic Empire at the time. And it's generally thought that it is distributed to at least 4 regions, that is to Medina, or it stayed in Medina. A copy was brought to Basra, one to Kufa, and one to Syria. Now, the question is, how much of that is actually true? In the 70s, especially in Western academia, there was a time of uncertainty about this. For a long time, Arabists followed this traditional narrative and basically thought, yes, the text was standardized early, etc. But in the 70s, especially John Swansborough and his famous students, Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, started casting doubt on this narrative. Sources that talk about the standardization are written at least 200 years after the events they report. Well, that's a long gap, right? How do you bridge that gap? How do you know that it's really, that it really happened the way it's being reported? And there was very little secondary evidence that it actually happened. So Wansbrough, somewhat famously, suggested that actually the Quran was only standardized 200 years later, so around the 850s. And that before standardization, there was actually a long discussion of what should and should not be in the Quran, what should be considered Quran, what should not be considered Quran, etc. Very comparable to, say, the canonization of the Bible, which had a very long kind of chaotic initial period. So already in the 70s and the years that followed, not everyone was completely happy with this story. Wasn't sure if this was right, whether we should really be so skeptical of the sources. But very little was being done with the material evidence to try and disprove it. Now, this is where my research and a lot of recent research that has been done comes in. Because there's been a revolution of primary sources, really something that really makes us look quite differently at how we understand the history of the Quran. So these days there are hundreds of manuscripts, all digitized, easily available through wonderful websites like corpuscoranicum.de, and we can actually study these and learn something about the texts. And therefore we can now actually test the traditional history, how much of this is true. And how to do this is by textual criticism and figuring out, how do these texts interrelate? Are they all the same Quran? Was there a standard text? How old are they? And it became clear quite soon that whatever date we put, those 200 years are much too late. We clearly have manuscripts that are earlier than that. So clearly some form of Quran was around in written form before that. But how much of it is right? How accurate is that? That is the question. So if you start looking at early manuscripts, something that you will notice immediately is that, no, they are not all absolutely identical, but they are very, very similar. The similarities between manuscripts are really quite striking. I've taken here two manuscripts. One is the British Library manuscript, that's the one on the left, that's over 2165, and on the right is the famous Birmingham fragment, and both of these contain just about the same portion of the Quran. It's one folio, it's the end of Surah Maryam and the beginning of Surah Taha. And you might wonder, okay, well, putting these two texts next to each other, how similar are they really? How many letters, are identical? How many words are identical? How close are they? The answer, for this manuscript at least, is very, very similar. So similar, in fact, that there's only one letter where these two manuscripts differ at all. Ironically, it's in the words Al-Quran, which in this manuscript on the left is written without an alif, and on the right with an alif. And that's the only difference. Everything else is letter for letter identical in these two manuscripts. And that is in no way atypical. I could have picked another page as well and would have been quite similar. And so most of the time, manuscripts, when you compare them to each other, they are mostly just different, basically only in alifs, some other stuff here and there. But incredibly similar, like extremely, extremely coherent in that sense, which really already gives an impression that there might be some truth to the idea that there was a single standardization event. Although one might wonder, was it indeed Uthman who did it? Wasn't it someone who did it later? Both of these manuscripts are really, really old, and probably both 7th century, which makes later a bit harder, but these are things we need to worry about and think about. So how do we go about that? Well, for textual criticism, we try to reconstruct the source text. We try to look at these texts and see, okay, what was the likely ancestor like? And that's not very hard when texts look this much alike, but nevertheless, can we show there was a single source text from which all these manuscripts in fact descend? Not just two manuscripts, these two may be very similar, but maybe there's another one out there that's totally different. Who knows? So how do we go about that? Well, how do you find a source text, or how do you prove that a text is descended from a single written copy? Well, when we are looking at manuscripts when we look at manuscripts, we try to look for evidence that have been copied from one another, whether we can see some kind of signal that shows that. And this is very similar to, say, plagiarism tests of term papers. So, if I'm grading papers or something like that, you do something similar, or usually computers do something similar. So if you have two texts that are virtually identical or almost identical, and they look, very similar, but every now and then they have somewhat different spellings. For example, the word color could be written in two ways. Either you write it with O or you write it with OU. If you would see that every time you have a text, color is always written with O or always with OU in very specific places in a text, then you would say, well, clearly they were copied from each other very meticulously, or literally just copy-pasted, which is what more typical in terms of plagiarism these days. But back in those days, we're actually writing it, and if they have the same kind of spelling variation in the same places, that suggests, well, you couldn't make that up. There's no reason for those spelling variations to exist. So two texts having those things makes them look very similar. Now let's put this into practice, not with some silly text about color. Let's look at the Quran. So here we can see, I'll just say this very quickly. Here we can see that actually the pattern isn't the same, right? So these two texts, they're almost identical, but color here is written with OU, here it's written with O, and here's written with O, and there's with OU. So these texts are not exactly the same. So it wasn't just literally copy-pasted, right? There's something going on there. They had some different opinion about spelling and these kinds of things. So taking that kind of concept of say, the color and color written with O or OU, we can find very similar kinds of patterns in the Quran. For example, this phrase, Ni'matullah, the grace of God, can be written in two ways. You either write it with a ta marbuta or you write it with ta maftuha. So either with this little ha form or the ta form at the end. And these two spellings both occur in the Quran. If you open up any print Quran today, you'll find these two spellings. And if you look at the distribution in print Qurans, you'll see that it's almost 50-50. So 12 times, well, it's about as close to 50-50 as you can get with an uneven number. So 12 times it is spelled with a ta marbuta, and 11 times it's written with a ta maftuha. And it's the same phrase, same pronunciation. There's absolutely no reason why these two would be different except by the whims of the scribe. So the scribe wrote one thing or wrote the other thing, and apparently both of those spellings were just acceptable, just like color and color are acceptable. Of course, there it comes down to a regional thing, whether you're British or American, but you can imagine that in an earlier phase, both of those spellings would have been acceptable. Now, what you can do is say, okay, this is what we see in modern print editions. This is apparently, a bit random. But what we can look is, okay, if it's really random, if it was just up to the whims of the scribe, when was it up to the whims of the scribe? Is it when the people wrote these modern print editions, which are usually hand calligraphied? And is that just, the spelling that came out because they wrote in both ways? Or can we show that manuscripts have the same kind of spelling over and over again in the same places? And if that's the case, then you can say, well, clearly it was copied from a single thing. And at one point, those spellings were up to debate and you could do whatever. But afterwards, people very meticulously copied it over and over exactly as they saw it in the exemplar they were copying from. And that's a very important thing. So if you would see the same spellings over and over, that would suggest they really had an exemplar. They had a written text next to them and another text, a blank page that they would write down on. So what can you do? Well, what you can do is you can look at 30 different manuscripts and look for all of these locations if they occur. Many manuscripts are fragments, but we can look at the places where they do occur and compare against each other. And what do we see? Well, we see that in a print edition, I'll show this. So these are the locations in the Quran. These are different manuscripts, which I've abbreviated very quickly. So this C here, this is, say, the standard print Quran. So these are the ways that it's spelled. So, for example, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 11, it is always written with a ta in this manuscript, in the standard text. And in Surah Al-Ma'idah 20, it is written with a ha. And in 14.6, it's written with a ha, 14.28 is written with a ta, right? It's a really quite a random distribution. But if we start looking at what other manuscripts do, we see, look, this manuscript, this is Q47, has, for 5.7, has a ha, just like this text, and has a ta for 5.11, just like this text, and has a ha this. And if you start looking at other manuscripts, they all write a ha. They all write a ta in 5.11. They all write a ha in 5.7. They all write a ta in 1672. They all write a ha in 2967, etc., etc. Extremely well copied. There are some exceptions. Those are the ones that I've highlighted, the blue ones over here. Sometimes you see spellings, and especially this one is quite chaotic. But all the other ones are really quite, there's only a single exception here, only a single exception here, single exception here, single exception here, there. All of these are meticulously copied. And what it shows that we see the same spelling over and over again is that all these manuscripts were meticulously copied from a written exemplar. They took a new parchment, started writing it. Then that text was taken, they took a new parchment and started writing it over and over and over and over again. All manuscripts that we have, except for one, which we'll get to later, follow this pattern. So all of them have been written from copied from a written exemplar. Early ones, I should say. Consistently the same spelling. That's what we find. Hundreds of examples where the equivalent of color is consistently spelled in the same way, in the same place in all manuscripts. This could only have happened if they all descend from a single source. Therefore, there was a single written source text, an archetype, from which all the manuscripts were meticulously copied. Now, okay, so there was a single standardization effort. The text was a standard text, and it was spread over the Islamic world afterwards. Now we have to wonder, what date was that? And how do you date manuscripts? It's very difficult. Manuscripts do not contain dates most of the time. At some point they start containing dates, but they're so late that they're not actually relevant. But the earliest ones generally are not dated. But through radiocarbon dating, which is a chemical process where we can figure out how old something is that is made of organic material, and indeed Qurans are made of organic material, they're made of parchment, which is skin. We can learn something about the date of manuscripts. And well, here's one manuscript. This is one that is held at Leiden, and it was carbon dated. And it has a probability of 89.3% that it was written in between 652 and 694 AD. So the second half of the 7th century. And if we start looking at more manuscripts, we have a whole bunch of them from that period, which really suggests that, and they are all part of the standard texts, which really suggests that a standardization can't have happened much later than 650, which is of course consistent with the time frame of Uthman standardization. Now, what else can we say? The other part of the story is that the Quran was distributed across the Islamic Empire. Well, can we show that? And with that, we need to do schematics. What are schematics? In textual criticism, we try to find out how different versions of a text relate to one another. If one text has several differences in relation to another, and then if a second text has those same differences in addition to others, then we can reconstruct the order of copying that these manuscripts have been copied. So I have three almost the same texts here, but if we start looking at what the differences are, we see first, okay, here, this one changed the spelling, color, and through, and violet was added over here. And the second one has all those changes. So color is now written OU, through is no longer written OUGH, but with a U. And violet was added in both, but it adds even more differences. Characteristic is suddenly written with CK, and blue is misspelled with EU. Now what we can say is we can kind of reconstruct, okay, who was first, who made some changes, and who made even more changes, because it's a layered effect. And what we can say is, well, clearly this was the original text, then some changes were made, and then someone else took this text, the second text, and made even more changes, but kept all the old changes. And that way we can see a kind of interrelationship to these texts. Now we can do this to the Quran too. In medieval works, we have many reports of small differences between Qurans that they find in Medina, Kufa, Basra, and Damascus. And we indeed find these in early manuscripts. So, for example, it is reported that in Medina and Damascus there's فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ, while Kufa and Basra is فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ. And indeed, that's exactly what we find. Here the Hua is missing, here the Hua is present. Two different manuscripts with two different spellings. So we can start looking at these, and this is a great paper by Michael Cook, and recently Hythem Sidky has done something very similar as well, and actually already Theodor Nordecke in the 1850s did something similar, but people mostly ignored it. He said, let's look at these variants that are reported in the literary sources, and let's see how they interrelate. And what we see is there's actually a very neat story that comes out of that, because what we see is that there are 16 unique differences where the Damascus manuscript is different from Medina, Basra, and Kufa. Then there are 13 differences where Medina and Damascus cluster together, and Basra and Kufa cluster together. Finally, Kufa has 6 unique differences compared to Medina, Damascus, and Basra. So it's on its own against these other 3. Now, what Cook noticed, this is the same Michael Cook who in the 70s still thought that the Quran was composed maybe 200 years later, by the way. He said, we can make a stemma out of this. We can say, well, Damascus was the original manuscript. Then when it was copied, 16 differences snuck in. And once the Basran copy was copied, it was copied from the Medina copy, and it introduced another 13 differences. And then when the Kufa copy was copied from the Basra copy, another 6 were introduced. That's not the only solution to these variants. You could also say it's this, that when the Medina one was copied first, and then when Damascus was copied from the Medina one, 16 differences were introduced, while when Basra was copied from the Medina one, 13 differences were introduced. So it splits at the Medina one, and then Kufa copies from Basra. You can also do it like this, or also do it like that. But those are the only 4 options. That's the only way that it could have happened. And once we actually look at manuscripts, we see that they actually belong to these different regions. So we see that you have Medina manuscripts, Damascene manuscripts, Basra manuscripts, Kufa manuscripts. So what does this tell us? I see I'm sort of running out of time, but I'll sneak in a couple of minutes. Material evidence really aligns nicely with the tradition. The Uthmans standardized the text, and the text was standardized around Uthman's time, according to the manuscripts. The tradition tells us that copies were made and distributed across the Islamic Empire, at least probably to Medina, Damascus, Kufa, and Basra. And indeed, in the manuscript evidence, we see that 4 master copies were distributed to Medina, Damascus, Kufa, and Basra. Now, what about other text types? And this is the last bit that I want to cover. We have some reports, traditional reports, that tell us, look, there were other Qurans besides Uthman's Quran. Ibn Mas'ud had his own Quran, so these are companions of the Prophet, Ubay, Ibn Abbas, etc. And they are said to have had different orders of surahs, sometimes more surahs, sometimes fewer surahs, and sometimes different wordings in certain places. Sometimes words were ordered in a different way, sometimes you just chose a different word. And there are reports that seem to suggest that, Ibn Mas'ud's codex was still around as late as the 9th century, and people were able to actually look at it and report what it said. But where are they? For a long time, scholars were wondering, where are they? And they were skeptical, are these reports just made up? What's going on with these? So they've long been skeptical of such codices, but if they really existed, where are they? But here's something where something really changed. The Sana palimpsest was found. The Sana palimpsest, well, that's this manuscript over here. It's a beautiful manuscript, very nice, and the text that we see here is just standard Quranic text. However, there's a text below it, and the text below it is not very easy to see until you use UV light, and then it comes out. And you see a text below the text, and you see some of these traces. And if you stare really, really hard at it and look at it really, really close, you can actually figure out what your original text said. And the original text is clearly Quran. It is clearly a Quranic text. However, it is not the same text as the standard Uthmanic text. It has different wordings. It has a different order of surahs. It has very similar variants to the ones that we find in these companion codices that are being reported upon. So this kind of shows that really there is something to it. There were other types of Quran, but all of those have disappeared. The Uthmanic text type became so dominant that even in this text, which technically retains it, has been robbed of, and the standard text has been written over. So there is some trace of these kind of companion codices from before standardization, or at least copies of companion codices of before standardization. So, to finish off, the Quran was standardized early. That's what we can see from the manuscript evidence. Probably during the time of Uthman's Caliphate, after the death of Muhammad, although technically the material evidence could also show it earlier than that. 4 copies were made of the standard text, distributed across the Islamic Empire, and after that, very meticulously copied. Virtually every single manuscript descends from this standard text type, this Uthmanic text type, from which was basically the basis for all manuscripts. The Sana palimpsest right now is the only known exception that we know of, but there's bound to be more at some point. With that, I would like to thank you.